I'm going to link this to an idea which will be referenced in all of our talks, the concept of counterfeit deviance, but before we leave problematic behaviors that may be misinterpreted as deviant. So on to this topic of counterfeit deviance. Obviously, people with autism, like anyone else, are capable of committing criminal acts. For this discussion, I wanted to divide things into two categories: that kind of legitimate perpetration I just mentioned and counterfeit perpetration. So a breakdown in theory of mind leads to a breakdown in a person's ability to understand how their behavior may appear, and in turn can lead to counterfeit deviance. As I mentioned, it's not that all illegal behaviors in ASD are counterfeit. Other things are as they appear. But even when things are as they appear, I think there is more to the story when autism is in the picture. I wanted to switch topics for a few minutes to pathways to offending, a class of issues that have to do with the sad state of affairs in our world, and a lot to do with the internet. One of the most common reasons for people with autism to get in trouble is internet-based crimes, and in particular, viewing images of child abuse.
Child pornography laws, and that's really what I'm going to be focusing on here, presume that anyone who crosses the boundary between viewing online sexual images of individuals over a certain age and viewing such images of those under that age are sexually deviant and dangerous to children. A young man with autism will very likely view all sorts of sexual material online with no clue that they're crossing any of these boundaries. And they'll do it often compulsively to a degree which causes greater concern about their behavior. The number of images possessed in child pornography cases is a very big factor in determining what the sentencing would be and what the attitude of prosecutors is going to be. The perfect storm that arises from this situation is evident in the following statement by a U.S. District Court judge in a sentence that was imposed in May of 2011. That's the next slide. There was nothing extraordinary about this case. This was a case of mere possession of child pornography by a young man who presented archetypical signs of Asperger's syndrome. He had significant capabilities in dealing with computers and technical issues, and yet he was extremely isolated and immature socially, with absolutely no consciousness of any of the boundaries that are laid out in the social or legal taboos relating to online sexual images. The other thing that's interesting about this is this particular judge who spoke so broadly about Asperger's as a defense had only experience with one other case she had heard about. And so, thank you very much. So she was speaking very broadly, which shows the inherent hostility toward excuses for looking at child pornography in general, but specifically autism, which she was very confused by, I think. So when we look at this perfect storm that I described, on the one side is the child pornography possession laws. The punishments are very harsh, and here I'm just talking about possession, basically not people who produce or create child pornography. Sentencing varies from one country to another, but there's a very common feature in all countries which do criminalize personal possession of child pornography, which is sex offender registration. As all of you know, and I think you do know, that jail time, although very difficult for somebody with autism, doesn't compare to the lifelong additional disability of being required to register as a sex offender, which superimposed upon the disabilities of having the condition at all makes life essentially very, very difficult. And of course, there's the stigma of somebody who's looked at child pornography. Prosecutors assume that that person is looking at child pornography because they have an interest in sex with children. The problem is that's really not the case in the clients that I'm talking about. And they are trained to believe, and this happens in sex offender treatment programs, trained to believe that the person who looks at images online of a child being abused has the same mental status as the person who physically abuses the child. And so this is the mind state that prosecutors and law enforcement bring to these cases. There are a lot of different kinds of degrees of child pornography laws in place in the country. The dark green countries are the ones that have the highest level of laws. The light green country they also have the typical laws banning possession of child pornography and so on. The sentencings may change. The yellow countries have no laws. The yellow countries have some law. The red countries have no laws. And the light green countries, you just see mostly in Northern Africa and the Middle East, have general bans on pornography. So there's not uniform treatment of child pornography around the world. But as far as sentencing goes, in the U.S., these are the average sentencing going from 1992 up to 2010. You see some dipping beginning in the 2008-2009 period. But basically, for those who receive child pornography or distribute child pornography, which can be very accidental, the average sentencing is over 10 years. For those who only possess child pornography or charged with possession of child pornography, the average sentencing is around 5 years. And the thing to understand here is that in the U.S., only 1% of individuals will get a non-jail sentence. So that means that 99% of the people charged get jail within these ranges, and that includes those with autism disorders. So, and we're trying to make some changes in that. I'll tell you about what I do and what needs to be done. But the point to make in this chart, looking at the difference between the two lines, receipt of child pornography is on the upper line as well. People don't have child pornography without receiving it over the internet. And so prosecutors can arbitrarily choose in the United States whether to charge, and I think other countries, whether to charge simple possession or receipt over the internet of child pornography, which allows them to include in the U.S. a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. Mandatory, it can't be deviated from by the judge. So this means in any case where a young man who has Asperger's has been viewing child pornography online, that person could be charged to a minimum of charged with receipt of child pornography and sentenced to 5 years in prison at a minimum. In contrast, here in England and Wales, when the records I found showed that almost around a third, only around a third are actually given prison for simple possession cases. What I don't know is what percentage of those include cases where issues of autism have arisen. I've had a very difficult time finding out the extent to which that is sort of on the radar screen in terms of determining the outcomes of these cases. The sentences are different. Canada has some mandatory minimum sentences, but they're much lower than U.S. In other countries, France, for production of child pornography, the maximum sentence is 5 years. For mere possession, the maximum sentence is 2 years. So it's a very big difference. But again, they all do involve reporting as sex offenders, which may be, I think in many cases, certainly is the bigger problem. On the side of the individual who has this autism condition, they have this problem of being, first of all, interested in sex. They on the internet looking to learn about romance and sex. They're comfortable with computers, but because of their social disability and not having learned about social conventions, no red flags go up for them when they look at erotic images where the age of the person who's depicted changes and gets lower and lower. They simply lack the blameworthiness that we normally associate with people who are viewing child pornography online, the blameworthiness we associate with criminality. But they're behaving like deviant persons, and hence the term we have of counterfeit deviants. The other problem is that it only takes very brief questioning by police to educate them about these taboos, educate them about the reasons why child pornography is prohibited. And then they parrot that back to the police in a statement taken by the police, and then they appear then to a judge or prosecutor as knowledgeable. And all their lack of social sense prior to that time gets wiped out because they quickly learn and absorb what this authority figure tells them about child pornography. And so it makes it very difficult for a prosecutor to later accept the notion of counterfeit deviance, the notion that they didn't really understand that this was wrong and that they had crossed those boundaries. The typical case, this is, and of course at the other end of it, if they go to prison, and to this point in time, the vast majority of them do, they suffer all the problems of a new complex social system that they have impossible for them to figure out. They become victimized. They will tattle. They'll tell on other inmates who violate the rules, which is not a good thing to do in prison, and they end up being held in solitary confinement in prison for most of the time. One young man I knew was in prison for 3 years, and he was in solitary confinement for 2.5 of those years. Finally, again, they are facing both sex offender registration on top of their disability, which I call civil death. Part of the problem in this is we have, as a result of the tendencies. Well, let me begin by saying when I've gotten cases like this, the first thing you notice is all of them involve parents who have struggled for a long time to give their child a normal life. They've done everything they can. And when they realize that the child is now in all this difficulty because of online viewing, they feel tremendously guilty about not having thought of this and not having trained their child and taught their child. And service providers, the clinicians, they feel terribly guilty about it because there really is nothing in place right now in most areas to educate children with autism about the dangers. And then they get to court, and they're basically given an ultimatum. If you don't plead guilty to this charge, then there could be a more serious charge of receipt involving a mandatory minimum sentence or whatever. And so the families generally end up quickly pleading guilty, have their child plead guilty. And it's the parents that decide this, by the way, as we all know. It's not going to be the child, even if the child is now 25 years old or 26 years old. Parents really don't know what to do. Part of the problem is that prosecutors, part of the problem is that prosecutors have no knowledge about autism. They have mistaken impressions about it. They feel that looking at child pornography is going to be considered as one of these fixated interests, special interests that can't be removed, and so they don't want to bring it up because they're afraid if they talk about Asperger's, the prosecutor or judge is going to say, well, this is one of their special interests and it's going to be there forever, so there's nothing we can do about it. They don't know enough to talk about the tendency to follow rules and how with proper therapy and behavioral therapy they can avoid this behavior. They will tend to go to a regular forensic psychologist or psychiatrist who knows nothing about autism, who very likely is going to come up with some other misdiagnosis, not understand the role autism plays and their lack of social adaptation plays in bringing on the behavior. So it becomes, the defense lawyer themselves become part of the problem because they don't properly understand how autism plays into it. With prosecutors as well, I've lost my prosecutor slide. So prosecutors, their primary concern is about child exploitation. That's their main thing. And as soon as they see somebody looking at child pornography, that's all they're concerned about. They see nothing but the danger. Also, the oddity, the fact that the person seems odd in some way, escalates their sense of danger. And so they are more likely to say this person is weird, and so that to me speaks of more danger. They're afraid of opening the floodgates, that everybody, as this judge said in one of the earlier slides, that everybody has Asperger's. Once they're charged with child pornography, everybody's going to say they have Asperger's, and the prosecutor's not going to be able to figure out how to differentiate between those who really have these severe social deficits that lead to a lack of blameworthiness in what they've looked at, and others who are simply looking for some excuse to avoid prosecution. Prosecutors don't see sex offender registration as being that big a deal. They say, well, we're just keeping track of people, and it really shouldn't make much of a difference. We know really otherwise. So looking at the principles that I espouse and am trying to advocate, one is that presumptively individuals who have these severe social learning deficits should not be prosecuted. If they don't know what's wrong, if these red flags don't come up, they shouldn't be prosecuted. It's not a defense at trial. These child pornography laws do not allow as an excuse that somebody does not know that it was wrong. So there really is a need to educate prosecutors and judges about this concept of counterfeit deviance as a way to conceptualize somebody who's engaging in apparently deviant behavior without actually having the mindset of somebody who we think is being criminal. And this involves, for the lawyer, lawyers do not like to have parents involved. They're not used to having parents involved in framing what the defense should be and how they should conduct the defense. They find parents of children with autism being meddlesome and overly protective and naive. And so because they don't really understand how the real world works, when the parents are trying to speak to the lawyer about the degree of deficits of their child, which they may not fully understand because they may have very inadequate diagnoses. They may never have had any kind of social adaptation skills testing like Vineland or ABAS testing to see what level that child's operating with respect to that his ability to learn what the social rules are and then apply them. So there's a total lack of information that defense attorneys have, and that's what is needed to be done. They need to find out from the parents, what's the story of your child? What is your child's developmental history? Tell me step by step what the struggles were for you as a parent in raising this child and getting them to learn how to deal in society. And then the lawyer can go and take that to the prosecutor and take that to the judge and say, this is different. This is not the kind of case you normally see, and this requires some different outcomes. But that takes a lot of work, and lawyers typically don't have enough time in the time schedule allowed to resolve these cases to learn all they need to learn. What they really need help from professionals, from researchers and clinicians who know about autism to teach them so they can teach prosecutors. So what my job, what I try to do is try to teach prosecutors about counterfeit deviance, tell them the entire history of the child, the struggles of the parent in raising the child, and get them to agree to not prosecute at all, to make this not a criminal case, divert it from the criminal process. Alternatively, what we need to do is get prosecutors to agree to let a person, if they have to plead guilty to some crime, make it a crime that does not involve sex offender registration. That's happened so far in the United States in only 4 cases. 3 of them were my cases. There's only been 1 case in the United States so far where there's been expressed diversion from criminal process for somebody on account of their autism, and that was a case of mine. So this is not a widespread, when I say this, that this is what should be done, this is not the reality yet. We're talking about a tiny, tiny amount of cases, and really the hope we have for the future of how these cases should be done. How am I doing on time here?
You're finished time-wise.
Okay, I guess I'm finished time-wise. The only thing I can say is I do have a paper on this that you can find just by Googling my name and Asperger's on the internet, and you'll find this right away. And it's a very long paper that tells you sort of where I'm coming from on all this.
Adolescence has been described as the second crisis. Individuals with ASD may have sexual feelings that are out of sync with their social and emotional levels of awareness. And as they grow older, this disparity gets greater and greater. Unfortunately, society tends to judge the person and base their expectations on the chronological age of the person with autism rather than their developmental age. So when we think about process models that explain general pathways to pedophilia, process models serve to explain the course of offending and the antecedents, behaviors, and consequences that are related to the offending behavior. So the most common model is the Finkelhor model, and that identifies pathways to child sexual abuse as progressing through 4 stages. So stage 1 considers the genesis of the event. The perpetrator may be a pedophile who has a specific sexual attraction to children and an emotional congruence. They may find sexual activity with children to be sexually arousing. They may identify more closely with children and may have a lack of sexual alternative sources for gratification. So in terms of the population of people with autism, regarding a pedophilic orientation, it's unclear and unknown the rates of pedophilia among people with autism. However, there are parts of stage 1 that may better explain why people with autism have sexual contact with children. This idea of emotional congruence, or more closely identifying with a child, may be the result that people with autism often have interests that are more typical of children and people that are younger, and as a result experience emotional congruence with children. For example, if any of you have read Dr. Nick Dubbin's wonderful book, Autism, Asperger's, Sexuality, and the Law, Dr. Nick Dubbin is a PhD who was arrested on possessing images of child exploitation. And when questioned, he said, I imagine myself to be the same age of the children in the images I was viewing, and I wanted to be friends with them. This issue of lack of appropriate sexual outlets may also apply to people with ASD. Many people with ASD do desire romantic and intimate relationships, but may struggle with the social skills required to have one of those relationships. There also may be external prohibitions against having relationships. For example, in many group homes in the United States, people with disabilities are prohibited from having a sexual relationship with anyone in the home. In stage 2, the offender develops mechanisms to override inhibitions that result from fear of being apprehended or the acknowledgement that they're violating social taboos. So the offender may use drugs or alcohol to override those inhibitions and those reservations. Or they may develop something called cognitive distortions, which allows them to interpret the behavior of the victim in a way that justifies or legitimizes their own behavior. So Dr. Lofton and I have worked with a number of different sexual offenders, both with and without autism, and they may say, well, adolescents are looking for it by the way they dress or the way they act. For autistic offenders, there may be little to no awareness of these societal taboos. For example, unless explicitly told, some people with ASD may not be aware that there's an age of consent. So as Dr. Westphal mentioned earlier, there may be times that the person with autism knows, I have to know the person, they have to like me, I have to like them, I have to ask their permission, but the piece they forget or have never been taught is, and they have to be over the age of consent. Stage 3 is overcoming external obstacles. So in stage 3, it's about surmounting the external obstacles with the goal of increasing activity and contact with the victim. Now, savvy predators may purposely place themselves in a position of trust and work diligently to gain the trust of a child. In the State v. Burr, which was a case in the United States, there was a piano teacher who was accused of fondling one of his students. And the defense claimed that contact with the child was misunderstood. The gentleman was sitting the child on his lap because she couldn't reach the keys. And the defense argued that the man with ASD lacked the social dexterity to groom the victim as a predator without autism would do. And that stage 3 is surmounting those external obstacles and accessing or gaining access to the child. Now, for the perpetrator with autism, the person may not purposely place themselves in a position of trust to gain sexual contact with the child. Rather, that contact may arise because of those shared interests that are immature relative to their chronological age. For example, we've worked with a number of people that have a strong interest in My Little Pony, which is typically not something interesting to an adult male, but is often interesting to adult men with autism. In stage 4, predators without autism attempt to overcome child noncompliance by breaking down the barriers that exist between themselves and the child with the goal of escalating the type and amount of sexual contact with children. And to do that, they use attractors like video games or money or the lure of fame, or interactors, drugs, alcohol, pornography, to lower the inhibitions of the child. They may also use intimidation and force against the child. Now, the person with ASD typically does not do this, in part because this would require the person with ASD to recognize that they had power over the child. And because of those difficulties with perspective taking, it would be difficult for them to determine how the child is perceiving them. So for these reasons, we feel that traditional process models, like the Finkelhor model, are inadequate to explain why people with ASD commit sexual offenses against children. So this is what we believe to be a better explanation of the potential pathways to offending for people with ASD. So there's this issue of naivete that Mr. Mahoney referred to. At times, people with ASD may be duped or dared into committing a sexual offense. We've worked with clients who have been dared to kiss that girl, touch that girl, pull down your pants and show that girl, etc. Then there's this idea of lack of sexual awareness. I've worked with clients who have been accused of sexual offending for masturbating in public, for urinating in public, or recently a case where a young man with significant developmental disabilities was on his way to the toilet and pulled down his pants on the way to the toilet. And when a mother in a cafe with her young daughter saw this, she reported it to the police, and he was accused of a sexual offense of exposing himself. Then there's this idea of lack of understanding of the inappropriateness of sexual relationships with minors. I have worked with people who have not realized that there is an age of consent and found out the hard way, that indeed there is an age of consent, and if a person over the age of consent has relationships with a person under the age of consent, that's a sexual offense. Then preoccupations with sexual connotations. As Dr. Westphal spoke about earlier, this idea of perfume. We've also worked with people that have had interest in silky garments and underwear and other things that have sexual connotations, and yet for the person with autism, it's more of a sensory issue of feeling silky things rather than something sexual. So it could have been anything silky, not necessarily an undergarment. And then there's this idea of the lack of sexual awareness around the social skills being so disparate as the person with ASD grows older. And as I mentioned in Nick Dubbin's book, he did say that he identified more closely with the children in the images that he was viewing than he identified with himself as an adult. So when I think about the differences in offending for the person with autism versus the person without autism, I'm reminded of a quote I once heard when a person without autism was convicted of a sexual offense. And he said to me, "Show me a kid who doesn't know about sex, and I'll show you my next victim." I can't begin to tell you the number of times that Dr. Lofton and I have sat across from people with autism in jail or in prison who have said to us, "I learned the rules by breaking them." I'm going to